Hi everybody, this is Lisa Nichols, and I wanted to share this lecture with the class. This is a lecture that I've put together that I have delivered many times, and this is about sexual abuse within families and the hope for healing. The information in this lecture comes from reputable sources and sites, and also some of my personal experiences as a counselor working with children who've experienced sexual abuse. If you remember from my introduction this semester, I have previous experience working at a couple different children's advocacy centers, and I've also been an expert witness in civil and criminal court cases regarding child abuse. So this is a subject that I'm very passionate about. It's very important to me, and it's very unique and something that not a lot of people like to talk about. So I will present this information to you. All right, so if we look at some of the topics that I'm going to go over, I'll start with a couple of client examples, and we will go into talking about different concepts of family dynamics, something called incest moms, the tip of the iceberg, and grooming. And then I'll also talk about victim recovery. That'll include things like saying no, how victims experience that, therapy and support, and court preparation. So I do want to say trigger warning with all of the content in this presentation. I will be talking about sexual abuse within families, and while I will not use graphic details, it is a difficult topic to hear about. If you are uncomfortable at any time for any reason, you are welcome to please stop watching the lecture. And also a word about gender. So we know that men and women, boys and girls, are both victims of sexual abuse. We know that boys are victims of sexual abuse within families too. But the primary victims that we know about anyway are girls. So for the purpose of the lecture, I'm going to talk about victims as girls, but it's important, that we remember that boys are victims as well. Okay, so let's test some of your knowledge here. If this was a live lecture, we would be able to do this together, but we are going to play along with my recording here. So let's check your knowledge about this topic. So what do you think? 1 in how many girls and 1 in how many boys are sexually abused before age 18? So we know it's 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys. All right, next. Less than what percent of child sexual abuse is reported to law enforcement? What do you think? Less than what percent? So less than 12% of child sexual abuse is actually reported to law enforcement. So next, what percentage of sexually abused children knew their perpetrator well? 93%. And who is a mandated reporter of child abuse in Texas? What do you think? So this is a trick question because it does include teachers, nurses, doctors, daycare workers, healthcare facility employees, juvenile probation officers, correction officers, licensed counselors. However, it's a trick question because in the state of Texas, every adult is a mandated reporter of child abuse. So all of us are mandated reporters to report known or suspected child abuse in Texas. All right, and what do you think here? Which children are among the greatest risk for being sexually abused? Do you think it's foster children, single parent with a live-in partner, or both biological parents? Which children are among the greatest risk for being sexually abused? It's actually single parent with live-in partner. Most people think it's foster children when we look at it this way. But no, children who are living with a single parent who has a live-in partner are 20 times more likely to be sexually abused. All right, what I'd like to do is tell you about a client that I worked with many years ago. Gabby, she was 10 years old when I met her and her family. So real quick, this is not actually Gabby. That's just a stock photo that I pulled from the internet. And her name was not actually Gabby. I also made that up. But anyway, let me tell you about this client that I worked with. Like I said, when I met her, she was 10 years old. Her brother, who was 13, was her alleged perpetrator. So her brother allegedly sexually abused her between the ages of 8 to 10. And what would happen is their parents would go out on date nights, just like some time to get together, focus on the marriage, go to dinner, go to a movie, just those kinds of things. And this is when the sexual abuse would occur, when parents would go out on this date night. So Gabby, at the age of 10, she did make an outcry to her teacher and told her teacher what was going on, what her brother was doing. What ended up happening with this family is when the parents found out that she'd made an outcry, they called a family meeting. So the four of them, mom, dad, Gabby, and her brother, they all sat down in the living room, and the parents asked her brother, "Is this true? Did you do this? Have you been doing this to your sister?" And he said, "Yes, I have been." And the parents made Gabby and her brother shake hands and hug, and they made the brother apologize to Gabby. And that was the experience there at home with the family. The family did participate in the requirements that were issued by CPS and the courts. So the brother went to juvenile detention. He participated in sexual offender treatment he participated in sexual offender treatment. And because he had participated in all these things successfully, and the family did a safety plan, he was allowed to come home. And again, remember, he was 13. So what the family did when the brother returned home is they put bells on Gabby's bedroom door. And the reason they did that was so that if he were to go into her room, say at night or while the family's in the kitchen or something, if he was to go into her bedroom, they would be alerted by the bells. Now, you might have some opinions about that, and you might have some opinions about the family meeting that they had, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, the other really, really good, really important thing that happened is while the brother was going through treatment, Gabby and both of her parents were participating in counseling at the Children's Advocacy Center. The next client I'd like to tell you about is another little girl I worked with many years ago. Her name was Emily, and when I met her, she was 12. So keep in mind, this is not really a picture of an abused child. I just pulled this off the internet, and my client's name was not really Emily. So let me tell you her story. Her parents divorced when she was really little, and when she was 10 years old, her mom remarried. Emily's stepdad is the alleged perpetrator of the sexual abuse. And the abuse happened when her mom was newly pregnant and Emily was 12 years old. After some time, Emily did outcry to her biological dad and her stepmom, who she did have regular contact with. So the stepdad was arrested, was placed in jail. He was released while he was awaiting trial. And during this time, the mom actually made the decision to relinquish her parental rights over Emily. One of the things that was happening is Emily went to live with her bio dad and stepmom, but obviously her mom had visitation scheduled as well. So mom by this time had a baby girl, and the stepdad was there living with Emily's mom and their new baby. And the safety plan included that whenever Emily was going to come to the house to visit her mom and her baby sister, the stepdad had to leave the house. He was not allowed to be there when Emily was there. And keep in mind, this is all while the trial is pending. So he's been indicted, but he's not been convicted of the abuse yet. So Emily would come over for a visit, and what they found is that obviously the visit had a scheduled time and date, but the stepdad wouldn't leave until Emily arrived. What he would do is he would get in the car and he would sit in the car in the driveway and wait for Emily to get there. So Emily would see him, and then she'd go into the front door, and then he would drive away. Another thing that was happening was when Emily would come over, she noticed, all the family pictures were still out at her mom's house. So she'd come back into the home where she had been sexually abused and would see all the family pictures and, the pictures of the stepdad. And this was really impactful and really harmful to Emily. So CPS eventually ordered that mom had to remove all of the family pictures during the visits. So what her mom would do is collect all the pictures with the stepdad, collect any signs of him, like his shoes, that were maybe by the front door, and would put everything in a box and put it in a closet. Unfortunately, what would happen is the mom would make a big deal about it. And she would say, "Oh, I forgot to take this picture down." So she'd often, in front of Emily, gather up all the pictures, gather up little belongings of the stepdad, and say, "I don't know why I have to do this for you, but let me put all this stuff away." And all of these things were really harmful and impactful for Emily. Her mom would also talk about missing the stepdad when he wasn't there and worrying that if he goes to jail, Emily's baby sister would grow up without her dad. So mom was under a lot of pressure from CPS, from the bio dad and the stepmom, who were protective. And she was also under a lot of pressure from the stepdad, who's her husband. So what she eventually did was just relinquished her parental rights. So she had no more contact with Emily, and she was no longer legally Emily's parent. You might have strong reactions to that too. She literally disowned her daughter and chose the perpetrator in the situation. What ended up happening, this case did not go to trial. The stepdad accepted a plea, and he went to prison for 2 years. He did get out of prison and reconnected with Emily's mom and his daughter, who was now probably 2 or 3 years old. And Emily continued to not have any contact with her mom. So you might think for a minute what your reactions are to both of the stories, but what I want to ask you to think about is, out of the two stories that we talked about, Gabby and Emily, who do you think recanted? Do you think Gabby did or Emily did? And recanted means they went back on what they said, like, "Oh, no, it didn't really happen. I made it up," or "I was confused." Who do you think was lying? Something to think about. Why is this important? You might have a strong reaction to me asking you this question. Well, this is the number one question that children are asked. This is the number one thing that people are going to look at first. Is this child lying? So yeah, it's important to look at. Did you think one of them might be lying? Also, why do you think the mom relinquished her parental rights? Why did she do that? What do you think about that? And also, who do you blame more? Do you blame the abuser? Do you blame the mom? Do you blame the parents more, or the teenage boy? So these are just questions to kind of gauge your reactions, to give you some things to think about. Right, so as we talk about sexual abuse in the family, this can include where the perpetrator of the abuse is the mom, is the dad, it's a step parent, parent's partner. It can be an aunt, uncle, cousin, brother, sister, grandparents. So all of those can be included when we talk about sexual abuse in the family. And another thing to keep in mind is that this happens within families with every level of education, every race, ethnicity, every socioeconomic status. This does not just happen to quote unquote poor people or uneducated people. What we find with sexual abuse in the family is that it's not as reported as often. And a lot of times families don't comply with therapy for the victim or for the perpetrator unless it's mandated by CPS. And another kind of unique commonality with sexual abuse in the family is that there's a threat of losing their other children. And parents can face, non-abusive parents can face charges of being non-protective of the children. All right, so let's look at the big question of why. Why does this happen in families? We know there are some commonalities between families that experience this. Number one is there are usually no boundaries in the family. So, for example, that includes like physical boundaries, like maybe bathroom doors aren't closed. Maybe kids aren't allowed to lock a door. Maybe sexual content is talked about openly, or videos or sex videos are shown openly. And it can also include emotional boundaries. So we might have situations where parents talk to their children about adult issues. And so they might have a lack of physical boundaries or a lack of emotional boundaries too. Also, secrets are a big deal in these families. So it's not uncommon to find that there are multiple secrets that are being kept within these families. And again, these are concepts of why sexual abuse would happen within a family. There might be other types of abuse happening within this home. So one of them could be intimate partner violence that might be happening. Or there might be other crimes happening in the home, so drug use, drug trafficking, anything like that. We also see some themes of patriarchy, so where men are the authority. They're not only the head of the household, but we do whatever they say. Women do whatever they say. There's an importance of recognizing that maybe sons are elevated higher than their mothers even. So maybe sons have authority after the father, more so than the mother does, and then more so than any female children do. And we see a lack of education, and I don't mean school education. We see a lack of sex education within these families. So there may be these blurred lines, this confusion of not being able to recognize what's inappropriate, not recognizing that there are boundaries, not understanding how bodies function, and what's normal, what are normal feelings for kids or for teenagers. There might be, we see that there's a lot of miseducation or lack of education about sex. And then we usually see generational trauma. So where maybe the mother was a victim of sexual abuse herself, maybe her mother was too. So it's not uncommon when we see sexual abuse in the family to also see that it has happened to multiple generations. So there's an interesting discussion and interesting things to learn about incest moms in particular. And they are moms whose usually daughters, but child has been sexually abused by their spouse or their partner. It might be the mother and her son has sexually abused her daughter. And there are different types of incest moms. And as we go through these, they'll make a little bit more sense as we talk about this. But this first one, this first type, this is where she did not know the abuse was happening. And when she found out, she denied that it happened. So, maybe she says, absolutely not. He would never do that. My daughter's lying, something like that. The next type is where she didn't know the abuse was happening. And when she found out, she sides with the abuser. So this might look like, oh, he was confused, he was drunk, he thought it was me, or I believe him that he would never do this. I believe him, and I don't know, she's making this up for some reason. So that's another type of incest mom. This third one is where she did not know the abuse was happening, and when she found out, she blamed the child. So this can look like, well, I talked to my husband and he said that she came on to him, that she did this to him and he didn't want to do this. Might also be, well, this is how she acts, this is how she dresses. So they didn't know the abuse happened, but when they found out about it, they blamed the child. Next is the type of incest mom who knows that the sexual abuse is happening and she doesn't stop it. There's this next one where she knew it was happening. She also helped set it up and she also participated in the sexual abuse of her child. This last one is the one that makes us all feel better. This is the mom where she did not know the abuse was happening, and when she finds out, she believes her child and she is supportive and protective of her child. So knowing these different types of incest moms can be really helpful if you find yourself ever working with these families, and to know that it's possible for moms to have known that the abuse was happening and they didn't stop it. It's also possible that they didn't know, but once they found out, they don't believe their child, or they side with the abuser, or they just flat out deny that it didn't happen. So the next thing to look at is that these moms also have different stages of denial. We talked about this mom doesn't believe that it happened, or she's blaming the child. There are different stages of denial. And again, if you find yourself ever working with these families in whatever capacity, this can just give you some insight into the mind of the incest mom, what she might be thinking or doing. And so there's this type of mom where she denies, there's an immediate, rapid denial of facts. So immediately denies, no, that didn't happen. That would never happen. He would never do that. And that's this first type of denial. Next, we have denial where the mom denies that it had a negative impact on the child. So this can look like, well, look at her, she's fine. I mean, maybe it was inappropriate or weird or something, but she's okay. Look at her, she's fine. Or, well, she was asleep. Or, well, she thinks it was a dream, so she doesn't really know, and I don't think we should tell her. These are the types of things that we see where denial is denying that it impacted the child. Next, we will see a denial of the extent of the abuse. So this is just minimizing the abuse. So maybe minimizing what the child said, minimizing how long it happened, like how many years it happened, or how bad, how severe the abuse was. So we'll see that type of denial. We also see this type of incest mom who believes initially, and then she goes into denial. And this we can see if you think about situations where the perpetrator is her son, and maybe she believes initially and then goes into denial, because it's hard to imagine or believe that your son would do this to his sister. We also see this within intimate partner violence, where the mom initially believes her child, but maybe through pressure or through abuse, she needs to side with her partner. And so then she goes into denial that this didn't really happen, or maybe it wasn't as bad as she said. Another type of denial that we see is where she believes that it happened and she blames the child. So she'll say things to the child like, you know not to sit on men like that, or I told you not to wear your nightgown when you come out of your room, or I told you not to be around him by yourself, things like that. And all of those things are assigning blame to the child. Of course, then there's this one where the mother comes out of denial. So she believes her child and she supports her child too. It's really fascinating work to see incest moms progress through these different types of denial. It does take very specialized counseling and group counseling, because the mothers can often see this in other mothers before they see it in themselves. So if we look next at some other things that are unique to incest moms, and what we see is, again, that we might see where moms are denying, minimizing, or hiding the abuse. They also have this perspective, if you think about it, that they view men as helpless, that men are helpless to their sexual desires or feelings or whatever you want to call it, and that once they start, they can't stop, or once they get turned on, they can't stop. And this is a view that's very actually emasculating, because it really portrays men as being helpless to just their physical needs. We also see a lot where girls are blamed and girls are at fault. There's usually a previous trauma history for the mom where she has been sexually abused, and maybe her mom did not believe her either. So if you think about that, there's also this very strong distrust of other women, where you have an incest mom who was sexually abused as a child. Her mom didn't believe her, so she distrusts other women because she hasn't had a woman be protective of her. And then the flip side of that is where we see these moms really idealize men and boys. They really see that men are just superior, and that they need to cater to men and make sure that they're doing what men want, and to always, in a sense, please men, while they also distrust other women. All right, so as we transition away from incest moms, and let's talk a little bit about the outcry, the child's disclosure of sexual abuse. And I want you to think for a second back when you were like maybe a teenager, and you had failed a class, and you needed to tell your parent or your caregiver that you failed. Generally, the way you started that was, I had some trouble in class this semester. You don't generally start with, hi, Mom and Dad, I failed. Also, let's say you went to a party that you weren't supposed to go to, people got drunk, you got arrested. The way you might tell your parents is like, the party got a little out of control, right? You don't start with, I got arrested, or my friends got arrested at this party. Another example is you're driving your parents' car and you were not paying attention and you wrecked the car. Well, the way that you might tell your parents is, okay, don't freak out, but I got in a little fender bender with your car. And so the point of all of these examples is that when we think we're in trouble, we will tell just the tip of the iceberg, right? Like we will just tell like, there's just a little fender bender and or a little damage to your car, and then you go out and look at the car and it was totaled. So if we think we're in trouble, just as human beings, we just tell the tip of the iceberg. We just tell a little bit of the story. And this is a very common thing that happens when kids disclose sexual abuse. So what they're going to do is disclose one part of the abuse, and that is the tip of the iceberg. And then what's going to happen is they're testing the reaction of whoever they told. They don't know they're doing this. This isn't consciously what they're deciding. And for some kids, it might be. But they're testing their reaction. They want to see, I'm going to tell this adult this part of the abuse, and let me see how they react. Let me see if they believe me. Let me see if they keep me safe. And based on that reaction, whether maybe they're not believed or blamed, they're not going to tell the rest of the abuse, right? If they tell one part of the abuse and they're blamed and they're not believed, then they're not going to tell the rest of it. They're thinking, oh, good, okay, I'm glad I didn't tell all the other stuff then, if I'm already in trouble for telling this part. And if they are believed and not blamed, then they will slowly over time start to tell the rest of the story. And just like an iceberg, has this huge mass below the surface, a lot of times that's how children tell their outcry and tell their disclosure, is they start out with one piece, and then when they start to feel safe and they're believed and they're not blamed, then they start to tell all of the other details that have happened. So why is this important? Well, people always think that kids are lying, or that they're changing their story, or now they're just making up details. But the reality is they're just telling the tip of the iceberg until they feel safe. So many times, once a child is in counseling, that's when the rest of the story starts to come out. And people who don't know might think, oh my gosh, they're changing their story. Or, well, now they're just making up details. But the reality is what they're doing is they're telling the rest of the story because they now feel safe. So regarding perpetrators, I think that most of us are familiar with the concept of grooming. And this is, of course, where a perpetrator targets a victim. So they choose a victim. They'll try to create a friendship, and then they're going to try to isolate that child. So those are key things that someone is going to do when they're trying to groom a child for sexual abuse. So some other things to think about, though, is that when someone is grooming the victim, they're also grooming non-victims. So they're also grooming other family members and people in the community. And what I mean by that is they are making sure that there are lots of people who see them as safe, who see them not harming a child, maybe expressing, how mature and what a good Christian person they are. And what they're doing is making sure that if the victim ever discloses the abuse, the other people will not believe the child. And that's what's happening. So if you've heard about or seen those cases where, someone's accused of child abuse and they, parade 12 different adults on the stand to talk about, what a great kid they were, what a great student they were, what a great athlete they were. And yeah, absolutely. And that's intentional. Grooming is not just about grooming the victim, but it's grooming the other people in the victim's lives so that they will defend the perpetrator if the child discloses the abuse. Of course, they might also, will seek positions where they have access to children. So, we've certainly seen this with, coaches, scout leaders, religious organizations, volunteering, different things like that, tutoring, where they have access to potential victims. Of course, again, positions with authority. We raise children to obey authority, right? So perpetrators know that, and they will seek out positions with authority because children will listen. They're also trying to trick and trap, right? Like that's the whole thing that they're trying to do. And so sometimes the way they start the abuse is by, oops, it was a trick, or oops, it was a trap, so that the victim immediately begins questioning if it was their fault, or maybe they misinterpreted something, maybe they misunderstood something. But from the perpetrator's perspective, it's deliberate. They're absolutely trying to trick and trap a victim. Another part of grooming that we'll see is where the abuser will test a potential victim with little secrets. So they might tell little secrets that are not horribly bad, but they want to see, is this child going to go run off and tell somebody? Or can they keep this secret? And if the child keeps the secret, then they might continue with the grooming, and they might feel like this is someone who I can victimize. Part of grooming, too, is giving alcohol or drugs to a potential victim or to a victim. And of course, what they're doing is tricking and trapping a victim. If the child's given alcohol, drugs, the teenager's given alcohol or drugs, that's minimizing their ability to speak up and say no, or to even vividly remember what's happening. Another part of grooming can be showing porn to the child and presenting it in a way of sex education. Remember, we talked about sex education before, and it's sometimes shown, sometimes done by showing porn to children under the guise of sex education. Like, I want you to know what this is or what's normal, or I want to see how you react to this. And these are all tactics that can and are used by perpetrators. All right, so next let's talk about trauma recovery. Let's talk about what are some of the factors that can produce hope and healing for victims. Well, one of the things that's really important in counseling with children who have been sexually abused by a family member is this concept of saying no. These are the questions that victims are asked very frequently. Well, did you tell him to stop? Why did you let him do that? Why didn't you scream and run away? You just let him do that? And these are all the different ways that people, family, friends, community, professionals are blaming the victim. And they're saying, why didn't you say no? Why didn't you tell him to stop? Another one is, I told you not to wear that. So addressing saying no in counseling is really important and really impactful for victims' recovery. And what we do is we help the victim identify the ways that they did say no. And that can include freezing. If you've ever heard of, fight, flight, or freeze, those trauma responses. So if a victim freezes and they say, I didn't do anything, I just froze, that's a way of your body saying no. If I run over to somebody and want to give them a big hug and they freeze, I know what that means. I know that they're uncomfortable, and I would then stop hugging them. So when a child freezes, adults know, older children know They don't like what I'm doing. They don't like what's happening, so I should stop. So freezing is the body's way of saying no. Children might also create obstacles like wearing pants, wearing layers of clothing, creating obstacles in their bedroom, different things like that. And these are the types of details that come out in counseling, and it's an opportunity to empower the victim and help them recognize you were saying no. You were trying to protect yourself in those moments, that you were creating those obstacles. That was you saying, no, I don't want this to happen. Also, when children emotionally disengage, this is similar to freezing. That's a way of saying no. Sex acts are so intimate, and if you think of a non-sex act and you think of how do you know you've made someone uncomfortable, you can tell by their body language, right? And if someone disengages, if someone zones out, you know that they're not interested or not paying attention or don't like what's happening. So the same thing is shared with children. We can read each other's body language. And so if I think you want to do something and you emotionally disengage and you shut down and you're not making eye contact and you're not talking, I know that you're not comfortable. And again, that's the body's way of communicating, I don't like this. I don't want to do this. Another thing is the body tensing up. This is a way of the body saying, no, I don't want to do this. We hear of victims, curling up in a tight ball, things like that. Another way of saying no is children or teenagers might often say, I don't know how. I don't know how to do that. They're asked to do something sexual and they'll say, I don't know how to do that. And maybe they were already taught how to, but they'll say, I don't know how. And again, that's their way of saying, no, I don't want to do that. And then similar to that, coming up with excuses to avoid the person. Many victims talk about how they came up with excuses to not be around the person or to, have to leave and go somewhere else, or, to be sick so that they got to stay home, things like that. And these excuses that they were giving, what's at the heart of that is they were saying, no, I don't want to be around this person because I don't want them to do what they're going to do. And this concept of saying no and the way our bodies say no is really important when you think of consent and when you think about how much victims are blamed for sexual abuse. All right, so as we look at 3 different types of treatment for survivors, so victims and survivors of sexual abuse. First, is no surprise, I think, is individual therapy. And some of the most effective ways of therapy include cognitive behavioral therapy. So again, like identifying ways that you said no with your body, that's cognitive behavioral therapy right there. And trauma-focused is really important in counseling as well. And then EMDR, if anyone's heard of that, that is newer in the sense that it's become pretty predominant in the last 10 years in the counseling world. But this is a way of restructuring the memories in your brain so that they do not cause trauma reactions. And it can be a way of healing from trauma. So those are all individual level. Group support is extremely important for victims of sexual abuse. Right away, they learn that they're not alone because they all think that they're the only one that this is happening to. And they might be told that too. So they know they're not alone. They see a whole room full of other children their age or other teenagers their age who've gone through the same thing. Also within the support group, a really cool thing can happen. Other kids in the group can identify some of the thought distortions that are happening. Again, they can see it in others before they can see it in themselves. So they may very honestly, vocally tell another child in group or tell a teenager in group, like, that was not your fault. Like, that's not what I knew, that that person was trying to trick you from what you just told me. That was not your fault. And it's very impactful, very, very impactful for victims to hear those types of statements that validate their experiences. You know, a counselor can say it 10 different ways, 10 different times, but when a victim says it to another victim, it's extremely powerful. Also within the support group, you can kind of they can confront each other about different things that can be helpful. And within the support group, you know, you might not think of it this way, but we're modeling healthy boundaries. You know, we're modeling that, oh, if someone sits too close to you, you can tell them to move and you can move, and they will. And this is what it's like to experience healthy boundaries. And the last one here is this court preparation. This is a process that can be done through children's advocacy centers or through victim advocate programs. And this was a really fun part of my job, where you literally teach the child about the different processes that happen within court, who all the different players are in a courtroom. It does not matter how young the child is. The child will be asked to testify. In fact, the child is required to testify in the state of Texas. So court preparation is extremely important to help them prepare for what's expected of them and to teach coping strategies to, of course, deal with the fear and the anxiety that they'll experience when they go into the courtroom. We're, as counselors, definitely trying to desensitize them to the way the courtroom looks and smells and to all the people who are in there and why everyone's in there. And we're also trying to help decrease their anxiety and give them ways to cope with the anxiety so that they can give their testimony and be successful at that. This is also really important because offenders are known to, you know, do things in the courtroom to intimidate children. And the defense attorney, doesn't matter that he's questioning a child, the defense attorney's job is to try to confuse, discredit, and blame that victim. And so again, this is a very important piece to victim and survivor recovery. I like to include this image here because this is also just an extremely powerful image. When a child or a teenager, when they have when they have the opportunity to see their abuser convicted and handcuffed and walked out of the courtroom, that is a huge moment of recovery, because that is a universal signal that that person was wrong. That person broke the law. That person's in trouble. Not you, not the victim. You get to just walk out of this courtroom and go home. But that person, everyone is recognizing that what that person did was wrong. And that's a huge, huge moment of recovery for victims. If they want to see that, that's an important image for them to see. And then just another thing about recovery. So whatever age the abuse happens, as the victim, you know, man or woman, grows up, goes through life, they're going to reprocess the abuse in a different way. And if you think about it, that makes complete sense. You know, the way that we thought of, you know, Christmas as a 5-year-old is different from how we thought about it as a 15-year-old. And then when we have kids, we think about Christmas in a different way. That's the normal life cycle and the way that we process things. And it's the same for child abuse. So it's normal for victims to reprocess the abuse that they experienced at a younger age. and all the different life events can impact that too. You know, the first time they fall in love, the first time they have sex, the first time maybe they have a child, different things like that. Those are all going to be natural times for a victim to need to maybe talk about it again, just kind of reconceptualize what happened. It wasn't their fault, that they were right in telling. All right, so that is my presentation here, and it went a lot longer than I meant it to. We're at 50 minutes. These are the different resources that I used for a majority of the information, and I want to just thank y'all for watching this very long lecture. And also, you have my email address, so send me an email if you have any questions about the presentation. If it triggered anything for you, that's completely normal and expected. If you've been through trauma, or if you know somebody who has. And so please know you're not alone. And if you want to contact me, I will connect you to the support that we have through the university.